on the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast exploring the week's big stories. My name is Amber Zaman and I'll be hosting Jalel Harchaoui, a Paris-based analyst who closely follows the Maghreb. I'll be talking to Jalal about Libya, where critical elections that were meant to be held this past Friday were cancelled. The oil-rich North African nation has been racked by violence since the overthrow of its strongman Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. The elections were meant to pave the way for political stability and national reconciliation, following an October 2020 ceasefire struck between warring factions backed by Turkey and Qatar on the one hand, and the UAE, Egypt, and Russia on the other. So what does the postponement mean for Libya? Welcome to our show, Jalal. It's great to have you on today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So can you briefly sum up for our listeners why the elections in Libya were postponed?
Well, I think one way to summarize it would be to say that all meaningful factions behaved with a very small amount of good faith. I would say that when this project became public, and that was in the fall of 2020, I think the initial reaction of any ambitious politician or leader in Libya was to instrumentalize this priority that basically was perceived as a Western priority, as it was perceived as something that was strongly suggested by the UN, not to say the US. And a lot of Libyan, I'm talking about the elites really, basically went, how could I possibly take advantage of this rhetoric that is probably going to dominate the entire political scene for the next year? I will do everything to sabotage it, and at the same time trying to find ways to accuse the other guy for having done a poor job preparing the elections. And that was basically, I think, an almost a universal behavior on the part of all the key players. And you also have to kind of keep in mind that a lot of the potential candidates also occupied very key positions. So there was a bunch of conflict of interest that kind of created a lot of problems. And I would say that even now that the deadline has been missed, I think a lot of those problems will remain.
So can I just jump in with another question? You mentioned the candidates and the foreign powers who seem to have so much more agency, sadly, than the Libyan people themselves. Could you just run us through who those main foreign powers are who seem to have so much sway over Libya, and who these candidates, particularly the more controversial ones, are, and how that sort of also complicated things?
Well, actually, I would like to push back on this a little bit. I think 2021 has been quiet on the international level. And I think a lot of the actions that actually mattered in 2021 in Libya were Libyan actions. A lot of the sophisticated ideas and strategies and tactics that were implemented were from Libyan actors, not necessarily determined by foreign states. I'm not saying that the foreign states are out of the picture, and I think they matter still, and they will become much more visible again, I think, within the next several months. I mean, the usual players, the usual suspects I meant were effectively Turkey. Turkey is entrenched militarily in the northwestern part of the country. It has been for 2 years now or more, and Turkey doesn't want to leave. And the prime minister that emerged in February, March of this year happens to be someone who's personally very, very close to President Erdogan. I'm talking about Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeibeh. Another way of saying the same thing would be to say that effectively that Turkey cannot dream of a closer, more convenient leader for Libya. So Turkey doesn't want successful elections, and it doesn't want any change. It wants the status quo. And then on the other side, you have effectively the Emirates. The Emirates has been much quieter over the last year or so. It doesn't mean that it ceased all of its activities, especially when it comes to political coordination and an ability to kind of invest on multiple tracks in terms of the various Libyan actors, depending on the province, and kind of plant the right seeds so as to be able to become more active again in the future if it needs to be. And the Emirates, although we saw those pictures of, the cordial meeting between Mohammed bin Zayed and Recep Tayyip Erdogan a few weeks ago, those antagonisms that have to do with ideology have not been resolved. And the Emirates continues to be deeply opposed to political Islam. Any kind of pluralistic arrangement that would leave a little bit of room for those kind of currents.
But
and then you have Russia.
The UAE's, I'm sorry to jump in, but the UAE's sort of guy in Libya, Haftar, really suffered a big blow, didn't he, because of Turkey's intervention. So who are the credible actors on the other side that the UAE can back in the hope of balancing this Turkish influence in Dbeiba, as you described it?
Well, for example, if you go into the reality of the Libyan capital, and the Libyan capital is out of reach now from Haftar's perspective, you have a militia that was put together over the last year under the nose of Turkey. And it was put together by a militia leader that is known for his close relationship with Abu Dhabi. And I'm talking about Haytham Tajouri. He's someone who kind of disappeared from the scene during the big war for Tripoli, and then returned in late 2020 during the autumn of 2020. And, in a way that was almost like visible in real time, was able to kind of purchase weapons and bribe some old members of his former militia and kind of put together a new brigade called the 777. And this happened inside the capital. And when you have something like this that happens, obviously with a direct connection with the UAE, this brigade is not disconnected from the rest of Tripoli. You have other militias that are opposed to the Dbeiba, opposed to Turkey, opposed to political Islam. And to see this guy make his comeback is a source of inspiration. It's also a source of material means and potentially money. So you have
Is he
like
getting any help from the Egyptians or the Russians?
No, it's more of an Emirati initiative. And you have other players. You have like also some, very strong politicians who are now part of the Dbeiba government, who actually helped him be designated in February. And those, I'm talking about like these two brothers by the name of Mlokta, those businessmen, former militia leaders, more senior than the guy that I just mentioned, are also linked to the UAE, and they somehow played a key role in the Geneva designation process in February for the Dbeiba to reach power. So you see, you have this diversification of risk approach. You have a multiple track kind of methodology followed by the Emirates. And all these things could be reactivated when needed. So I don't think anybody should walk away with the impression that the UAE just has all of its eggs in the Haftar basket. Haftar is still very important symbolically. He's very recognizable. He's still, trying to be charismatic, and he's very powerful in the eastern half of Libya. But you need people on the ground in the west to make headway, and the UAE has certainly not stopped being active on that front.
So why does the UAE care so much about Libya?
It cares so much because Libya is a very wealthy country, and wealth matters when you care about ideology, because when you have this small population of less than 7 million, a beautiful location, incredible natural resources in terms of reserves of oil and iron and and platinum and all kinds of other natural resources, then it means that any ideology can succeed if you live it in peace. If you just, are not active enough, if you don't view it as a priority, you're going to wake up one day and then you'll have, something like political Islam playing a key role in Tripoli, this prestigious North African capital. And people, I'm talking about other factions in Sudan and Egypt, in Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, everywhere, will draw the conclusion that political Islam is okay, that you can succeed, you can become prosperous, you could be at the top of a peaceful society that kind of shines. If you have that happen as a showcase for the wrong ideology, then you'll have a contagion that will probably
though you
back
have
into.
to admit that the Islamists themselves have been doing a pretty good job of discrediting themselves, as we've seen in Turkey, where the economy is kind of collapsing along with the
True.
rule of law and the rest
True.
of
I
it.
mean,
And Turkey's image, and then in Tunisia too, where you saw the Islamist party sort of basically kicked out, albeit
true.
through an auto golpe, as they call
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I mean, they're shooting themselves in the foot. That's absolutely true. But I would say that those examples that you correctly mentioned are rather recent. And what I've been trying to describe is a constant philosophy that has been followed by the UAE for more than 10 years. And I think if I were them, I would do exactly the same. I would do everything to prevent, a scenario where any kind of political party could take advantage of an easy situation like Libya in a context of peace. So you do not want to leave it the chance. You cannot just say, I'm going to leave them alone. Maybe they will succeed, or maybe they will shoot themselves in the foot. You're going to interfere and do basically what the US did in Latin America and other conflicts where you intervene
But it
because you
seems
care
like
about
it's a bit of
ideology.
a stalemate all the same, even though you say this guy Tajuri has sort of regained a foothold in Tripoli. The fact remains that the Turks are very much there still with their troops, and I guess with their mercenaries, though I'm not sure. Have they gone back to Syria?
No, there's still more than 3,500 mercenaries backed by Turkey and northwestern Libya. Look, 2021 has been a stalemate, but I think it is wrong to conclude from there that 2022 will look the same. I think one novelty in 2022, quite possibly, I might be wrong, but I think Turkey will have to fight in the new year to stay in northwestern Libya. That is a big step back compared to the easy ride that they've had over the last year. So if they end up having to kill Libyans just to stay, it means that it's potentially the beginning of the end. And that's the feeling that I get right now. So, I wouldn't extrapolate based on 2021 and say that Turkey is out of the woods, everything is static, they're going to stay forever. That's not true. There's a lot of factions that are very well organized that dislike Turkey, that dislike, more importantly, the Libyan friends of Turkey, people that are making a comeback, that continue strengthening simply because of this security umbrella that has been in place. But so let's try to imagine 2022, and I imagine it being more difficult for Ankara.
And where do you place Gaddafi's son, since we were talking about the presidential contenders and how controversial some of them are? Where do you place him in all of this? Because his candidacy did create quite a stir. And of course, and the fact that he's gotten that far, even having been convicted of war crimes, is again a reminder of how far we've regressed, writ large in this Arab Spring experiment, with people hankering after the quote unquote good old days of dictators that were at least stable and predictable.
Yeah, I mean, Saif definitely utilized this context of elections, this obsession about elections. What does it mean when you speak of free and fair elections? It means liberal democracy, right? And liberal democracy is basically the ideology that is preferred by Washington and its Western allies. And those states effectively intervene militarily to help destroy the Muammar Gaddafi system. So this year, what we saw is basically his son stage a comeback, stage a media comeback. And I really insist on this. You know, it hasn't been a security or military or even a political comeback. It's not very well organized. What it has existed in the media, in social media, in the form of clicks, you know, a lot of likes, you know. There's even like revolutionary Libyans that I know who admit, you know, when you talk to them, that if they had seen him on a ballot, especially within the context of a second round for the presidential, they would have voted for him, they say. But the elections are not happening. And
So you
on
don't
the
think they're
ground,
going to happen at all, and we're going to be stuck?
I think we should continue being very alert and we should be aware of the strong possibility, in my analysis, that you know, we'll be having a similar conversation in December 2022. It's very possible.
And you think that this transitional government can survive till then? And as you mentioned,
I think
Labour is a rather controversial figure, certainly not an impartial one to be able to continue in this role, particularly given that he also presented himself as a candidate when apparently he wasn't supposed to.
right.
Now you have
The
this
enemies of
thing
the
about the
Labour.
British ambassador, you know, supporting him. Where does this all lead?
Well, first of all, I think what the British tweet indicates is more of a clumsy move by the diplomatic team responsible for Libya on the part of the Brits. But I don't want anybody to think that the Brits are the only ones who have this preference of saying, you know, why don't we keep the Beba until elections are organized? You know, they're not the only ones. You have the Italians, you have even states that dislike political Islam that are tempted with this option of kind of helping maintain the Beba until elections are happen. I'm including France, I'm including Russia, I'm including a lot of people. But the Beba does have, of course, a lot of enemies amongst Libyan elites. He's quite popular with the population, with the public. But in terms of the Libyan elites, there are a lot of people who hate him and they would love to dislodge him. They would love to topple him. But what I see right now is that they're not really, you know, thinking of using elections to topple him. They would like to just topple him or weaken him or exert pressure until he crumbles sometime, you know, in the near future.
You mean through violence?
So it's not necessarily an electoral. I'm sorry?
You mean through violence?
Potentially through violence, yeah. Potentially through violence, absolutely, yeah.
So
yeah, I think that's the reason I was mentioning the militias that exist in Tripoli that are happy to use at least the deterrence of violence to kind of pressure him. And when you play those kinds of games, then you could easily slip into a form of conflict.
So, yes. I mean, then potentially, if as you describe things, we have Turkish forces fighting UAE-backed forces in the Libyan capital, that would, of course,
well, you see, the problem. Yeah, I think
but it would portend a broader conflict again. I presume.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're raising multiple very good points here. It is true that if Tripoli becomes this huge question mark, then necessarily this acute crisis within the capital itself will reopen all kinds of wounds elsewhere in the country, and it will invite you know, a return of violence on other fronts.
And what can be done to stop that? What can the United States do? Does Russia want to stop it? And the EU obviously does, because of, first of all, for very selfish reasons, right? They don't want more Libyans, more immigrants using Libya as a sort of launching pad.
Well, you know,
Europe.
Regarding Europe, I mean, this correlation between Libyans killing each other and resurgence in migrant statistics, this correlation was not true at all during the big war for Tripoli, the 14 months between April 2019 and June 2020. And from there, European decision makers in Brussels no longer deduce that you have to kind of avoid conflict in Libya just because you care about migrants. There's no correlation, apparently. For example, the 2021 has been quiet between Libyans, and it has seen a rise in the number of irregular arrivals in Italy. So unfortunately, the coalition doesn't work, and as a result, you don't have this kind of false humanitarian concern on the part of Brussels decision makers for Libyans when it comes to the conflict between themselves, just because the Europeans are selfish. It doesn't work. But in terms of Turkey, you said that Turkey might use its military presence. It is a difficult thing for Turkey to do, because Turkey is quite present through its own 700 or 800 officers, its drones. It has a fleet of at least 20 drones in Tripoli, and it has, the Syrian mercenaries. But can it use those assets to stop killing Libyans? This is a very difficult line to cross. Right now it's kind of standing.
I completely agree with you. And besides, again, going back to my previous question, would the United States not intervene in some way to prevent that from happening?
Well, we saw a very ugly war again for Tripoli, and the US did certainly not intervene. The way it intervened was indirectly, by giving the green light to Turkey for it to kind of, offset the presence of Russia and the UAE. That's how it kind of brought about a form of peace. So this idea of a direct intervention of the United States.
I don't mean militarily, but through diplomacy and a mix of, carrots and sticks, sanctions, that sort of thing, threat of, or whatever. I don't know.
What I've learned about the Americans when it comes to Libya is they're very ambivalent. It's not considered a very important file in Washington. So the people who manage it day to day kind of are always, they're never decisive. They're always playing with, there's always a disconnect between the rhetoric and the day-to-day behavior of those decision makers.
Plus, they're very distracted by their own problems at home, not to mention this big crisis in the Ukraine. So,
yeah. So right now, I think there's a temptation to kind of surf and navigate from short-term crisis to short-term crisis. I don't think we should expect clarity on the part of the Americans. It sounds pretty
depressing, to be honest. But just so we can help our listeners understand a bit how things work. I mean, in the meantime, people have to survive, to live, and as you said, Libya has enormous oil and gas wealth. How does that get produced, sold, and how does the income get shared among all these sort of adversaries who run the place?
Good question. We were talking a few minutes ago about Dbeibeh. There's another characteristic of Dbeibeh as a prime minister. For the first time, you have a head of state, because that's what he is, a head of state that benefits from a very, very close alliance with the governor of the central bank. And the governor of the central bank is, to me, the most powerful man in Libya. The reason is because he holds the purse strings. So I'm referring to the amount of dollars that are generated from the extraction of oil. Libya produces, somewhere between, 750,000 and 1.3 million barrels a day. And that, to give you an idea, generates something around, $22-23 billion a year at the current prices. And all of it is spent. Everything is spent. It's spent mostly in the form of civil servant salaries and in terms of food. Very little goes to infrastructure, although the Dbeibeh tries to spend more than usual in projects and reconstruction efforts. So right now, inflation is kind of painful, but not too painful. Prices are more or less stable. Access to dollars, which is crucial to import stuff from outside, is kind of smooth because of this alliance, the political alliance between the governor of the central bank and the prime minister. So things have been relatively okay under the Dbeibeh.
But aren't the ports controlled by Haftar, the ports through which the oil is?
Yeah, but Haftar had to abandoned his blockade in September 2020,
Right.
he might be playing with the idea of reintroducing the same kind of ploy, this idea of blockading the oil exports in 2022. It's definitely something that could happen, but it hasn't happened over the last year or 15 months. So he has just two modes, right? He either blocks everything, or he lets things flow and then tries to get money from Tripoli. And Tripoli has been sending money to Haftar. You should not imagine that he is like completely being strangled. The Tripoli of the Beiba has been quite nice with Haftar. The reason he's still putting together these intrigues, that consist in hurting the Beiba is simply because you have the same mentality of a maximalist victory that is constantly sought after by most players, not just Haftar and everybody else. But there's been a form of modus vivendi that has prevailed during the last year.
So a mixed picture. Well, Jalal, thank you so much for being with us today. That was super interesting, slightly scary. Let's hope that, things somehow miraculously improve in the new year. Thank you, Jalal.
Thank you very much. I hope it's useful. Thank you very much for your trust.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
So that brings us to the end of this week's episode on the Middle East. I hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to being with you again in the new year. Have a fantastic holiday.